Hello. Earlier this month, we celebrated the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in February, we will celebrate Black History Month. Did you know that the Fair Housing Act likely would have never passed if not for the civil unrest and riots that resulted from the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? I am Maabi Muñoz, 2024 president of the Oregon REALTIST, a local board chapter of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the premier network of Black real estate professionals and the oldest minority professional trade association in America. And I'm excited to tell you a bit more about the history of how the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. In 1947, African American real estate brokers formed the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, also known as NAREB. A quick note about association names. The National Association of Real Estate Boards also called themselves NAREB before changing to the National Association of Realtors. For the rest of this video, if I say NAREB, I am not referring to NAR, whose members are realtors, but rather the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, whose members are realtists. With a clear fair housing mission, democracy and housing, NAREB worked hand in hand with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to advocate for open housing laws and the Fair Housing Act. NAREB has played varying influential roles in the implementation of equal rights, fair housing, equal opportunity, and community development legislation at the local, state, and federal levels since its founding. Some significant early policy achievements of NAREB were the first local housing legislation in 1962 in New York City, the first state fair housing legislation in 1963 in California, and the first national fair housing legislation in both 1947 and 1968. After passing the Civil Rights Act in 1964, lawmakers refused to pass fair housing legislation until they were jolted by two shockwaves in 1968. The Kerner Commission report and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Kerner Commission was established by President Johnson to investigate the so-called race riots that swept many large cities in the mid-1960s. The commission's sobering report pulled no punches, stating that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, created and maintained by white institutions and upheld by white society, was a leading cause of racial tensions. 5 weeks after the report was released, King was assassinated, igniting more civil unrest and protest and riots. President Johnson seized the moment to demand Congress pass the Fair Housing Act to show that King's dream of equality and justice would live on. A week after King's death, the act became law. In 1970, 2 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, Black homeownership was 41.6%. It reached its height in 2004 at 49%. Today, Black homeownership stands at 42.1%, almost the same as nearly 50 years ago, compared to 72% for white Americans. The economic downturn of a decade and a half ago hurt many Black homeowners with high foreclosures, upside-down mortgages, and financial upheaval from which many are still struggling to recover. While obvious obstacles like Jim Crow segregation no longer exist, Black Americans still face obstacles to owning homes. Obstacles like credit scoring, which is based not on how diligently we pay our bills, but on how much consumer debt we can amass. Obstacles like crippling student debt, which database shows impacts Black Americans deeply. For example, Black Americans owe an average of 188% more than white Americans. Obstacles like the well-documented unfair mortgage lending and appraisal practices. This is why this work continues to be so important. We stand on the shoulders of NAREB founders and visionaries like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who fought so hard for equality, but the fight is not done. We have so much further to go. We hope to see you at the Fair Housing Summit on February 23rd at 9 a.m. via Zoom, where we'll take a deeper look at many of these issues and talk about how you can be empowered to help to continue the fight for fair housing for all. Thank you, and we will see you next month.